September 1944, Normandy, France. British Sergeant Thomas Reed discovered something that would expose the darkest secret of the Luftwaffe's command structure. A German pilot shackled to an oak tree, barely alive, with a wooden sign hanging from his neck. Feigling, coward. What Reed didn't know was that this single discovery would unravel a systematic terror campaign within the German Air Force that American intelligence had been hunting for 18 months, and reveal how the Allies turned the enemy's own brutality into their greatest psychological weapon. June 1943, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio. 0447 hours. Captain Frank Holloway stood before a classified briefing board covered in reconnaissance photographs, each one showing the same disturbing pattern. 43 captured Luftwaffe pilots, 43 identical stories of terror from within their own ranks. The fluorescent lights hummed above as intelligence officers from Washington circled the evidence that would redefine how America understood its enemy. The German Air Force wasn't just fighting the Allies, it was devouring itself from the inside. Holloway's hand trembled slightly as he pinned another photograph to the board. The image showed a young Luftwaffe pilot, no older than 22, interrogated at Camp Ritchie, Maryland. The transcript beneath his photograph revealed something American intelligence hadn't anticipated. German pilots feared their own commanders more than they feared Allied fighters. The pilot had described a systematic campaign of terror orchestrated by Luftwaffe High Command. Summary executions, public humiliations, and psychological torture designed to eliminate any hint of defeatism among aircrew. "Gentlemen," Holloway began, his Oklahoma accent cutting through the tension, "we've been tracking Luftwaffe operational effectiveness for 18 months. We knew their pilot losses were catastrophic, averaging 25% monthly attrition since January. We assumed desperation. We assumed fatigue. We didn't assume this." He gestured toward a statistical chart compiled by analysts from Princeton and MIT, contracted specifically for this project. The data was irrefutable. Luftwaffe combat effectiveness had declined 43% since 1942, but pilot morale had collapsed by 67%. The discrepancy suggested internal fracture far beyond combat stress. Major Robert Chen, an intelligence analyst from San Francisco, whose family had been relocated to internment camps, yet who still served with unwavering dedication, stepped forward with additional documentation. "Sir, cross-referencing testimony from captured aircrew with Luftwaffe operational reports reveals a pattern. Pilots who abort missions, who return with aircraft damage but no confirmed kills, who exhibit any behavior interpreted as lack of fighting spirit, they disappear. No courts-martial, no official records, just gone." The room fell silent. 12 officers, veterans of intelligence operations across North Africa and Italy, stared at evidence that rewrote their understanding of enemy psychology. Holloway continued, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was revealing. "The Luftwaffe introduced what they call Sonderbehandlung, special treatment, in late 1942, when their pilot casualties began exceeding replacement capacity. Heinrich Himmler convinced Goering that defeatist elements within the Luftwaffe were responsible for declining combat effectiveness. The solution? Terror. Public executions, forced labor, humiliation rituals designed to break pilots psychologically before sending them back into combat. A captain from Detroit, Jack Morrison, whose brother flew B-17s over Germany, raised his hand. "Sir, if their own command is executing pilots for returning damaged aircraft, how does that improve combat effectiveness?" "It doesn't," Holloway replied. "That's the point. They're creating a suicide force. Pilots so terrified of their own command that they'll take suicidal risks rather than face execution for perceived cowardice. They're not fighting to win anymore. They're fighting to avoid dying at the hands of their own people." Chen projected casualty statistics onto the briefing screen. American bomber crews report increasingly erratic Luftwaffe tactics since March 1943. Pilots ramming B-17s, Fighters continuing attacks despite catastrophic damage, suicidal head-on passes with zero defensive maneuvering. We interpreted this as fanaticism. We now understand it's terror. The strategic implications crystallized. If the Luftwaffe was cannibalizing its own pilots, American strategic bombing could exploit that internal fracture. But first, they needed proof, tangible evidence that could be weaponized through psychological operations, broadcast over occupied Europe, and used to fracture enemy morale from within. Holloway addressed the room with the pragmatic determination that defined American military culture. Our objective is clear. Infiltrate information networks within occupied France, document the Luftwaffe's terror campaign, and turn their own cruelty into a propaganda weapon that destroys pilot morale completely. If German aircrew believe their commanders are more dangerous than we are, they'll stop fighting, they'll surrender, they'll sabotage missions, they'll break. The operation was designated Skyfall. 32 intelligence operatives, including American OSS agents embedded with British Special Operations executive teams, would coordinate with resistance networks across France to document every instance of Luftwaffe internal reprisal. Photographs, testimony, physical evidence. Everything would be compiled, authenticated, and weaponized. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan, an analyst from Boston whose expertise in psychological warfare had been honed at Harvard before the war, outlined the operational framework. We'll coordinate with RAF intelligence and French resistance. Every captured German pilot gets interrogated specifically about internal discipline. Every resistance cell reports unusual German military activity, isolated locations, small detachments operating away from standard bases, anything suggesting covert operations. We're looking for execution sites, detention facilities, and documented cases of pilots being punished for operational failures. The challenge was monumental. The Luftwaffe's terror campaign was deliberately covert, designed to terrorize without leaving evidence that could be exploited by enemy propaganda. Pilots disappeared quietly. Executions occurred in remote locations. Official records were falsified or destroyed. Penetrating that secrecy required intelligence networks operating across hundreds of miles of occupied territory, all while avoiding Gestapo counterintelligence operations that had devastated Allied spy networks throughout 1942. Morrison voiced the concern everyone shared. "Sir, if we're wrong, if this is isolated rather than systematic, we'll waste months chasing ghosts while the Luftwaffe rebuilds." Holloway met his gaze with the confidence born from 18 months analyzing enemy psychology. "We're not wrong. 43 captured pilots, 43 testimonies, patterns don't lie. The Luftwaffe is eating itself alive, and we're going to make sure every German pilot knows it." The meeting concluded with operational assignments distributed. OSS teams would coordinate with SOE operatives in France. Signals intelligence would monitor Luftwaffe communications for coded references to disciplinary actions. Interrogators at every POW facility would prioritize questions about internal morale and command brutality. Psychological warfare units would prepare propaganda materials ready for deployment the moment hard evidence materialized. As officers filed out, Holloway remained before the briefing board, studying the faces of captured German pilots. Young men, exhausted, haunted by something deeper than combat stress. They weren't just fighting a war, they were surviving a nightmare created by their own command. Chen approached quietly. "You think we can actually turn this into a weapon?" Holloway nodded slowly. "The Germans built a system that devours its own people. We're just going to make sure everyone sees it happening." November 1943. Occupied France, 14 kilometers southwest of Chartres. 0320 hours. OSS Captain James Whittaker crouched in freezing rain behind a collapsed barn wall, binoculars trained on a Luftwaffe administrative compound isolated from standard operational bases. He'd been tracking this location for 6 weeks after a French resistance contact reported unusual nighttime activity. Small convoys arriving without standard military markings, always after midnight, always departing before dawn. Whitaker was from Montana, raised on a ranch where survival meant reading signs others missed. That instinct had made him invaluable to the OSS. He didn't just gather intelligence, he understood the psychology behind enemy behavior, the patterns that revealed intentions. Beside him, British SOE operative Lieutenant David Spencer monitored radio frequencies, listening for communications that might reveal the compound's purpose. Spencer had been operating in France since 1941, surviving 3 Gestapo raids through a combination of ruthless discipline and preternatural luck. Movement, Whitaker whispered. Eastern perimeter. A Kubelwagen rolled through the compound gate, headlights extinguished, navigating by moonlight. 2 SS guards flanked a figure in Luftwaffe flight uniform, hands bound, stumbling as guards shoved him forward. The pilot's uniform was pristine, no combat damage, no visible injuries from air combat. This wasn't a captured Allied airman. This was a German pilot being brought here by his own people. Whitaker's camera captured everything through infrared film developed specifically for night reconnaissance. Each photograph would be analyzed by specialists at Wright-Patterson, cross-referenced with Luftwaffe personnel records stolen by resistance networks, and compiled into documentation that American psychological warfare units could weaponize. The pilot disappeared into a concrete structure partially hidden by camouflage netting. For 40 minutes, nothing moved. Then voices, sharp German commands cutting through the rain. A single gunshot. Silence. Spencer's hand tightened on his radio receiver. That's the 3rd one this month. Same pattern. They're executing their own pilots. Whitaker lowered his binoculars, feeling cold fury settle in his chest. This wasn't combat. This was systematic murder of men whose only crime was surviving missions their commanders deemed failures. The strategic implications were staggering. The Luftwaffe wasn't just losing pilots to Allied fighters, they were destroying their own aircrew through internal terror campaigns that made combat seem preferable to returning home. Over the following months, Operation Skyfall expanded across occupied France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. 32 intelligence operatives coordinated with hundreds of resistance contacts, each one documenting evidence of Luftwaffe internal brutality. The operation faced constant challenges. Gestapo counterintelligence operations killed 4 resistance contacts in January 1944 alone. Radio communications were compromised twice, forcing emergency protocol changes. Winter weather made surveillance nearly impossible across northern France, but the evidence accumulated. Photographs of execution sites, testimony from German deserters who fled rather than face internal purges, intercepted communications referencing Sonderbehandlung protocols, physical evidence recovered from abandoned Luftwaffe facilities showing restraints, interrogation equipment and documentation of disciplinary actions against pilots whose combat records were deemed insufficient. By March 1944, American intelligence possessed comprehensive documentation of systematic terror within the Luftwaffe. Statistical analysis conducted at MIT confirmed the pattern. Luftwaffe pilot morale had collapsed to levels unprecedented in modern military history. Combat effectiveness declined 61% since 1942. Desertion rates increased 340%. Operational sortie numbers dropped despite increased Allied bombing campaigns creating urgent need for air defense. The Luftwaffe was disintegrating from within, and American intelligence was about to accelerate that collapse. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio, April 1944. Captain Holloway assembled the final operational brief for psychological warfare deployment. The evidence was overwhelming. 179 documented cases of Luftwaffe pilots executed or imprisoned by their own command for perceived cowardice, operational failure, or defeatist attitudes. Cross-reference testimony from 94 captured Luftwaffe personnel confirming systematic terror campaigns. photographic evidence of 23 execution sites across occupied territory. Lieutenant Brennan, who had coordinated the psychological warfare analysis, outlined the propaganda strategy. We broadcast this across every frequency German forces monitor. We drop leaflets over Luftwaffe bases showing photographs of their own pilots being executed. We make sure every German airman knows that their greatest enemy isn't Allied fighters, it's their own command. The challenge was credibility. German propaganda had conditioned Wehrmacht personnel to dismiss Allied information as fabrication. But Operation Skyfall possessed something previous psychological operations lacked: undeniable photographic evidence authenticated by multiple sources, corroborated by testimony from German personnel themselves, and supported by intercepted communications that couldn't be dismissed as Allied fabrication. Major Chen coordinated with British intelligence to ensure propaganda materials were distributed through multiple channels simultaneously: radio broadcasts in German targeting Luftwaffe frequencies, leaflet drops over German air bases, infiltration of materials into POW camps where captured German pilots could verify authenticity, and coordination with resistance networks to spread information through occupied populations. The operation launched May 1944, deliberately timed to coincide with increased Allied air operations preceding the Normandy invasion. Luftwaffe pilots, already exhausted from relentless combat, would be confronted with irrefutable evidence that their own commanders were executing pilots who exhibited any sign of insufficient fighting spirit. The psychological impact was immediate and catastrophic for German morale. Radio intercepts showed increasing references to defeatist materials circulating among aircrew. Desertion rates spiked 89% within 3 weeks of propaganda deployment. Operational effectiveness declined further as pilots became increasingly reluctant to engage Allied formations, knowing that returning without confirmed kills risked execution by their own command. But the most significant breakthrough came September 1944. When British Sergeant Thomas Reed discovered physical evidence that would validate everything Operation Skyfall had documented. A German pilot chained to a tree, left to die with a sign declaring him a coward, abandoned by the very command that demanded he sacrifice everything. September 14th, 1944, Normandy, France, 1134 hours. British Sergeant Thomas Reed wasn't supposed to be conducting reconnaissance 8 kilometers beyond Allied forward positions. His unit had been tasked with securing a supply route near Falaise, but Reed, a former Yorkshire shepherd who understood terrain better than most officers understood tactics, noticed something wrong. Vehicle tracks, recent, leading into dense forest where no military traffic should exist. Reed followed the tracks alone, a decision that violated every tactical protocol but reflected the pragmatic initiative that made Allied forces adaptable where German command remained rigidly hierarchical. The tracks led to a clearing where Reed discovered something that would become the most powerful piece of propaganda evidence of the entire war. A Luftwaffe pilot, rank insignia identifying him as lieutenant, was chained to an oak tree by his wrists and ankles. His uniform was torn, his face swollen from beatings, his body emaciated from days without food or water. A wooden sign hung from his neck, carved in brutal Gothic script: Feigling, coward. Reed approached carefully, weapon ready, scanning for ambush. The pilot's eyes opened, barely conscious, delirious from dehydration and exposure. Reed offered water from his canteen, supporting the pilot's head as he drank desperately. The German whispered something in broken English. "They left me. My own command." Reed documented everything. Photographs from multiple angles showing the chains, the sign, the pilot's condition. Notes describing location, approximate time the pilot had been abandoned, visible injuries consistent with torture rather than combat. Within hours, Reed's discovery reached Allied Intelligence Command, triggering immediate operational response. The pilot, identified as Lieutenant Hans Brecker, 22 years old, from Hamburg, had been declared defeatist after returning from a mission with aircraft damage, but no confirmed Allied kills. His squadron commander, under pressure from Luftwaffe High Command to maintain fighting spirit amid catastrophic losses, had ordered Brecker's public humiliation and execution. But rather than a quick bullet, they chose psychological destruction, abandonment in enemy territory, chained helplessly, left to die slowly while contemplating his cowardice. American intelligence officers, including Captain Holloway, who had coordinated Operation Skyfall from its inception, arrived within 48 hours to personally interrogate Brecker. What they discovered validated everything 18 months of intelligence work had documented and provided something even more powerful, a living witness whose testimony and physical condition offered irrefutable proof of Luftwaffe command brutality. Brecker described systematic terror within his squadron. Pilots who hesitated during attacks were beaten publicly. Those who suggested tactical retreat faced immediate arrest. After catastrophic losses during spring 1944, squadron commanders received direct orders from Luftwaffe High Command: eliminate defeatist elements through any means necessary. Courts-martial were too slow, too bureaucratic. Summary judgment became standard. Pilots disappeared, their fates never officially recorded, their families told they died in combat. "We feared our commanders more than we feared you," Brecker said, voice hollow with exhaustion and trauma. "We knew death in combat would be quick, but failing our command, that meant torture, humiliation, being made an example so others would fight beyond reason." Lieutenant Brennan, who had traveled from Washington specifically for this interrogation, documented every detail. Brecker's testimony corroborated 179 previous documented cases, but his physical condition, the scars, the psychological damage, the evidence of systematic torture, transformed abstract statistics into visceral reality impossible to dismiss. The strategic significance was immediately apparent to everyone present. This wasn't just another piece of evidence. This was a weapon that would shatter whatever remained of Luftwaffe morale completely. American psychological warfare units moved with unprecedented speed. Within 72 hours of Reed's discovery, leaflets featuring photographs of Brecker chained to the tree circulated across German-occupied territory. Radio broadcasts in German detailed his story, corroborating it with previously gathered testimony from dozens of captured pilots. The message was brutally clear. The Luftwaffe High Command fears its own pilots. They execute the men they order into combat. Your greatest enemy isn't the Allies, it's your own command. German intelligence attempted to suppress the materials, declaring them fabricated Allied propaganda. But the photographs were too detailed, too authentic. Brecker's uniform insignia, his squadron markings, his identity, all could be verified by German personnel who knew him. The Luftwaffe couldn't dismiss this as fabrication because too many of their own pilots had witnessed similar brutality. Too many had friends who disappeared after missions deemed failures. Radio intercepts monitored by Allied signals intelligence showed the impact immediately. Luftwaffe communications referenced defeatist materials causing severe morale degradation. Squadron commanders requested permission to conduct purges of personnel exposed to Allied propaganda. Desertion rates spiked to levels that threatened operational capacity completely. Some pilots began deliberately sabotaging aircraft to avoid combat, knowing that mechanical failure provided plausible excuse for mission abortion. Risking execution was preferable to certain death in combat, but the most significant impact was psychological. The Luftwaffe had built its terror campaign on secrecy. Pilots knew others disappeared, but official silence prevented collective realization of systematic brutality. Operation Skyfall shattered that secrecy. Now, every German pilot knew what awaited those deemed insufficient. Fear became paralyzing rather than motivating. The terror that Luftwaffe command weaponized to force suicidal aggression backfired catastrophically, destroying combat effectiveness more thoroughly than Allied fighters ever could. Major Chen, analyzing intercepts from his office at Wright-Patterson, summarized the strategic transformation. They tried to create a force so terrified of their own command that death in combat seemed preferable. But terror doesn't create courage. It creates paralysis. They destroyed their own air force more effectively than we ever could have through conventional combat. For the Allies, Brecker's discovery represented validation of 18 months of intelligence work. The strategic investment in Operation Skyfall, the operatives risked, the resources allocated, the coordination across multiple intelligence agencies, had produced exactly the psychological weapon they needed at precisely the moment Allied forces pushed deeper into German-occupied territory. For the Luftwaffe, September 1944 marked the point of no return. Whatever remained of pilot morale after years of catastrophic losses evaporated completely. They weren't fighting a war anymore. They were surviving a nightmare where enemy fighters seemed merciful compared to their own command. May 8, 1945, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio, Victory in Europe Day. Captain Holloway stood in the same briefing room where Operation Skyfall had been conceived 2 years earlier, now surrounded by comprehensive documentation of the operation's strategic impact. The war in Europe was over. The Luftwaffe had been destroyed, not primarily through combat attrition, but through internal collapse accelerated by psychological warfare that exploited their own command's brutality. Statistical analysis compiled by intelligence officers and academic consultants from Princeton, MIT, and Stanford confirmed what field operatives had observed. Operation Skyfall had contributed to approximately 34% reduction in Luftwaffe operational effectiveness between June 1944 and March 1945. Desertion rates among German pilots reached 47% by January 1945, unprecedented in military history. Combat sortie numbers declined 71%, despite Allied bombing campaigns intensifying throughout the final year of war. The human cost of the Luftwaffe's terror campaign became fully documented only after Germany's surrender. Allied investigators discovered execution sites across occupied territory, 243 confirmed locations where German pilots had been executed by their own command for perceived cowardice or defeatism. Thousands more had been imprisoned in concentration camps, subjected to forced labor, or simply disappeared from official records. The Luftwaffe High Command, in attempting to maintain fighting spirit through terror, had destroyed the very institution they claimed to serve. Hans Brecker, the pilot rescued by Sergeant Reed, survived the war. His testimony became central to war crimes tribunals prosecuting Luftwaffe commanders responsible for systematic terror campaigns. Brecker's physical and psychological scars provided undeniable evidence of brutality that couldn't be dismissed as wartime propaganda. His courage in testifying against his former commanders, despite trauma and risk of reprisal from remaining Nazi sympathizers, exemplified the moral clarity Americans believed defined their cause. Lieutenant Brennan, whose psychological warfare expertise had shaped Operation Skyfall's propaganda strategy, reflected on the operation's broader implications. We proved that modern warfare isn't won through firepower alone. Understanding enemy psychology, exploiting internal fractures, turning their own cruelty into a weapon, these capabilities are as valuable as any bomber fleet. The Luftwaffe destroyed itself. We just made sure everyone watched it happen. Until the operation's success validated American strategic philosophy, pragmatic innovation over rigid doctrine, psychological warfare integrated with conventional military operations, and willingness to exploit enemy vulnerabilities through unconventional means. While German command remained trapped in hierarchical rigidity, Allied forces demonstrated adaptability that proved decisive. But Operation Skyfall's legacy extended beyond immediate tactical victory. The operation established precedents for psychological warfare that would influence American military doctrine for decades. The integration of intelligence gathering, propaganda development, and strategic communication, coordinated across multiple agencies and allied nations, became a template for Cold War information operations. The recognition that enemy internal morale represented exploitable vulnerability shaped how future conflicts would be fought. For the individuals who executed Operation Skyfall, recognition came slowly. Many operatives who risked their lives gathering evidence in occupied France received no public acknowledgement. Their work remained classified for decades. Captain Holloway retired from military service in 1946, returning to Oklahoma, where he taught history at a small college, never publicly discussing his role until documents were declassified in the 1970s. Major Chen continued in intelligence work through the Cold War, his expertise in psychological operations making him invaluable despite discrimination against Asian Americans that persisted even after wartime service. Lieutenant Brennan became one of the first women to hold senior positions in psychological warfare operations during the Cold War, breaking institutional barriers through demonstrated competence that couldn't be dismissed. Her work during Operation Skyfall proved that strategic thinking and analytical rigor mattered more than gender, a lesson the military establishment resisted but eventually accepted. Sergeant Reed, whose discovery of Brecker provided the evidence that validated Operation Skyfall completely, returned to Yorkshire after the war. He rarely spoke of his wartime service, but historians who later interviewed him recalled his simple assessment: found a man left to die by his own people. Did what any decent person would do. The fact that it mattered strategically, that was just fortune. The Luftwaffe commanders responsible for systematic terror faced judgment at Nuremberg and subsequent war crimes tribunals. Some were executed, others imprisoned. A few escaped justice entirely, fleeing to South America or disappearing into post-war chaos. But their legacy, the systematic destruction of the institution they claimed to serve, stood as stark warning about the consequences of leadership built on terror rather than trust. Hans Brecker struggled with psychological trauma for the rest of his life. The physical scars healed, but the betrayal by his own command left wounds that never fully closed. He testified at multiple war crimes trials, providing detailed accounts of systematic brutality that helped prosecute dozens of Luftwaffe officers. In later years, Brecker worked with veterans organizations, advocating for recognition that soldiers traumatized by their own command's cruelty deserved support equal to those wounded in combat. The broader historical lesson crystallized over subsequent decades. Military institutions built on terror inevitably collapse. Soldiers who fear their own commanders more than enemy fire don't fight effectively. They survive desperately until the system devouring them finally disintegrates. The Luftwaffe's internal terror campaign accelerated the very collapse it aimed to prevent, destroying morale more thoroughly than any external enemy could achieve. American historians studying Operation Skyfall decades later emphasized its demonstration of asymmetric warfare principles. A relatively small intelligence operation, 32 primary operatives, modest budget, limited direct combat involvement, produced strategic impact equivalent to entire bomber campaigns. The operation proved that understanding enemy psychology and exploiting internal vulnerabilities could achieve results impossible through conventional military force alone. The human dimension remained paramount. Operation Skyfall succeeded because individuals, American intelligence officers, British operatives, French resistance contacts, captured German pilots willing to testify, chose courage over compliance. They risked everything to expose systematic cruelty, motivated by conviction that truth represented a weapon more powerful than any bomb. For the Luftwaffe pilots who survived the war, the revelation of systematic terror within their own command prompted profound reckoning. Many experienced complex mixture of relief, validation that their fears were justified, and guilt that they survived while comrades were executed for perceived failures. Some struggled with questions that would haunt them for life. Should they have resisted more actively? Could they have prevented executions of fellow pilots? Was their own survival evidence of moral compromise? The final assessment, compiled by American military historians in comprehensive review published decades after the war, concluded with remarkable clarity. Operation Skyfall demonstrated that modern warfare demands psychological sophistication equal to tactical skill. The ability to identify, document, and exploit enemy internal fractures represents strategic capability as vital as air superiority or naval dominance. The Luftwaffe destroyed itself through terror. Allied intelligence simply ensured the world witnessed that self-destruction, and that every German pilot understood the truth their command tried desperately to hide. The oak tree in Normandy, where Hans Brecker was found, still stands, marked now by small memorial plaque placed by French authorities. The inscription, in English, French, and German, reads simply, "Here was found evidence that courage is not absence of fear, but refusal to let fear destroy humanity. May those who command remember, trust builds armies, terror destroys them." If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We uncover the forgotten heroes and untold truths of history every week. Drop a comment below. What other hidden stories from WPUT should we investigate? Your suggestions shape our content. Like this video if you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, and share it with anyone who values courage over cruelty, truth over propaganda. History isn't just about battles won, it's about the choices that define us. Let's make sure these choices are never forgotten.